Hello and welcome to episode 16 of my Stuarts vlog. We're still in theme 3 and this time we're going to look at the structure of society and the status of women. You would expect in this theme generally to get change and continuity questions, perhaps looking at the whole time frame from 1625 to 1688, and that would certainly be true, I would think, of these topics. Do be careful to distinguish between the structure of society, which I wouldn't normally include women in because women kind of fitted into the structure at each level. They're not a separate part of the structure. The structure of society is normally about how the framework is with the king at the top, of course, and then nobility, gentry, merchants, yeomen, and then peasants and paupers, that sort of structure. The status of women would be like their position in society. And then you might get something a bit more general about changes to society or the way society worked, where you could kind of fuse those two areas together. But just be a little bit careful to really address the question and not get caught out by those. So first of all, let's think about the structure of society. The structure of society is, as I just said, the king at the top, and then a sort of triangle coming down with the nobility, the gentry, the yeomen, merchants, professionals, kind of all mixed in there, and some of those will overlap a bit with gentry. And then underneath that, labourers, peasants, and paupers, the very poor at the bottom. And in the Stuart era, in the 17th century, there's still kind of a firm belief that the structure of society is ordained by God. There's something called the great chain of being, which people felt was that structure, and that God had placed them in that structure, and that therefore it was kind of against God if you were revolting against that system. I guess obviously the higher up you were in that system, the more likely you are to believe that and to try and endorse that and control that. That said, there were some changes within the system. So if we start at the top and work our way down, firstly, the monarch, of course. The monarch is only there for 2/3 of our course, and therefore that part of society is there's quite a big change. But just underneath that, the nobility. In fact, if you take the nobility and the gentry together, apparently they would add up to about 5% of the population. So actually we're talking about quite a small elite at the top, and they would control around 70% of the land. So it's quite an unfairly weighted system against them. In fact, the nobility in 1633, however, there were actually only 122, presumably male, members of the nobility. So the nobility is even smaller. Now, the two big things that happen during the 17th century that affect them are firstly inflation, and the jury seems to be a bit out as to how that affects them. On the one hand, their wealth is mostly bound up in land. And if prices are going up, but their income isn't going up, then that would affect them quite badly. On the other hand, people have said, well, inflation goes up, so that means rent prices can go up, and food prices on the land where they're generating, where they're growing stuff, those going up, that will help them. So it's probably a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of inflation and its impact. The thing that really does affect them are the political shenanigans through the 17th century. Most of the nobility will have backed Charles I in the Civil War. Not all of them by any means. The House of Lords, for instance, split about 1/3 to Parliament, 2/3 to the Royalists. But those Royalists will have spent money helping out Charles in the Civil War, and then will have been fined and perhaps lost lands during the Republic era afterwards. So that in itself is quite a hard time for the nobility, and they lose their political influence because the House of Lords is banned during the Republic. However, in the Restoration, of course, things do come back, and they don't gain all those lands back by right, but they do gain back some of that political influence. So it's kind of a wavy line, really, for the nobility. Under then the gentry, numbers of gentry increase about 300% in the Stuart era, and really it's quite a good era for them, I would say. They start to gain positions such as the upper gentry become MPs, members of the Privy Council. Lower gentry could become JPs, sort of local, justice of the peace, local law enforcement and bureaucracy. Judges, they could become too. They become the biggest social class at university, and they develop new farming techniques from that and improve their farms, improve their yield, which improves their financial status too. Examples of men who were part of the gentry: John Hampden, John Pym, Oliver Cromwell. And from that, you can also see that their political influence, again, is a bit wavy, but it grows and then slacks off a bit in the Restoration, but not as much as, not to go back to the position they were at the start. So at the start, Parliament's asserting itself. That's the gentry. In the middle bit, and the Republic, the gentry are running the show, so that's very much the peak of their powers. And then towards the end, the nobility, of course, and the monarch come back, and that means they have less influence. But I would say the gap between the nobility and the gentry was kind of wideish at the start. If anything, the gentry kind of, but by the end, it's quite close, and the gentry, I would say, improve more than the nobility lose ground. Hope that makes sense. Thirdly, then, merchants. Their trading merchants increase as trade increases through the era. Apparently there are 30,000 trading merchants in 1688. Overseas trade increases a lot. The fair amount of war with the Dutch brings about new trade, and also stimulates trade merchants on the up, as trade is on the up. And we'll cover this a little bit in the fourth theme, but also trade within England starts to grow, and of course urbanisation, particularly the growth of London, means that more trading merchants are needed. Also, as more trade is needed, more doctors, more lawyers, more architects, more financiers required, and so professional jobs increase, both in the amount but also just in the variety. At the start of this era, you'd expect, if you're a professional, you kind of be more likely to be a clergy than anything else, but by the end there are a lot more options available to professionals, and there are a lot more of them. So I'd say they're on the up too, and increasing. At the lower end of things, so the other thing to say is that there's a fair amount, or social mobility. It's not a fair amount of social mobility, but there is some social mobility, both in those professionals and merchants perhaps being able to access the gentry through increasing wealth, but also going the other way, unfortunately. Yeomen can become gentry too if things are going well for them agriculturally. But there were a number of peasants who became got kicked off their land because of enclosures. They become labourers, and of course we saw last time with poverty and growing unemployment, those people are dropping down a level into the level of pauper. So there's a fair amount of increase and change, but I would say that by the end, by 1688, you've still got the same structure to society. It's just perhaps that the bands have grown or shrunk a bit. The gentry's influence has grown, and of course merchants are more important than they've ever been before. I hope that helps with that bit. We're just moving on now to thinking about women. I'm afraid it, of course, as always, is a less happy story. Women were considered to be inferior to men during the 17th century in all sorts of ways: mentally, morally, psychologically, physically. And because of that, married women, or perhaps to justify that, married women were the property of their husband. They had very few legal rights of their own, and in theory, the status of women did not change really through the 17th century. But the beautiful thing for historians and for analysis is that actually that simplistic picture has a much greater story behind it, and there's much greater variety in that story than that sort of straightforward answer. And that said, women were more likely to be accused of witchcraft and adultery than men, and I wouldn't want to overstate the changes that are made to them. Most women were not educated. However, there were a number of ways in which things did kind of begin to change a little bit. If we start with the upper end of things, I suppose, higher status women, as in women who were nobility or gentry, could and often did act as part of the kind of family business. So they could be estate managers alongside their husbands, or play a role in the family economy through the family business on a more informal basis, and they wouldn't sort of have legal rights, but they kind of play a role and have some authority within that position. Classically, of course, during the Civil War, when there are men away, you come across quite a few women who play various roles that would normally be taken by their men. two great examples of that are Mary Banks, Bankes, at Corfe Castle, a royalist who withstood the siege against the parliamentarians for, I think, 3 years in the Civil War. And Brilliana Harley, what a great name, Harley, Harley, a parliamentarian in Herefordshire who at Brampton Bryan Castle again withstood and fought off a royalist siege herself, or leading her household in that. Lucy Hutchinson is another example, who was a writer, a poet, a biographer, a translator of ancient texts, and did that sort of semi-independently. So these are all examples of specific women for whom the sort of classic story is not quite doesn't quite fit. And there were also during the 1640s and 50s apparently around 300 women prophets. Women prophesying in terms of religion. In 1643, there were 10,000 women who took a petition to Parliament to free John Lilburne, the Leveller leader led by his wife. And so there were women kind of bucking the trend in various ways through this period. And two good examples of that as well. One good example of that are the Quaker women too, who are in favour of education. Puritans were often in favour of women being educated as well, so they could read the Bible. But Quaker women in particular were educated, and there was a sense in the Quaker movement of the equality of women, such that women were allowed to speak out and participate in Quaker meetings on an equal basis with men. However, of course, there were very few Quakers really in the whole country. One final note is that in Charles II's era, there was an end to the ban of women performing on stage, and so women gained one more right, although women who performed on stage did not have great reputations. So overall, the picture for women is a negative one and a very little change, certainly no official change coming down. However, there were individual women and women in some groups, a small minority, who are able to punch through those difficulties and who start to hint at changes to come in the future. So I hope that helps, and next time I'll be thinking about changing ideas. See you there.